I still remember that night in New York as if it had happened yesterday, even though years have passed since then. The chandeliers in the Harrington estate glittered above me, their crystals scattering golden light across the ballroom. The house itself was something out of a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Its walls were lined with oil paintings of ancestors, men in waistcoats and women in gowns, all carrying that same sharp Harrington pride in their eyes. Marble floors stretched beneath my heels, polished so perfectly I could see my reflection every time I looked down. To anyone else, it might have been breathtaking, but for me, it felt like a stage, and I was the actress everyone had gathered to watch stumble. I wore a gown I had saved for months to buy. It wasn't couture, not stitched by some Parisian designer, but it was elegant and fit me perfectly. The deep navy silk hugged my figure and shimmered when the light touched it. I had bought it at a boutique on Fifth Avenue, putting nearly every dollar I had into it, telling myself it was worth the sacrifice. Tonight was supposed to mark my true introduction into Michael's world, a chance to show I belonged at his side. Even if my roots were humbler than most of the people sipping champagne around us, Michael had promised me it would be fine. "They'll see what I see," he had said earlier that evening as he adjusted his cufflinks, his reflection in the mirror calm and confident. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that love was enough, that the way he held me close at night and whispered his dreams for the future would outweigh whatever his family thought of me. But as soon as we stepped into that glittering ballroom, I felt eyes on me, measuring, comparing, judging. The Harrington name carried weight in America and beyond. Richard Harrington, Michael's father, was more than just a wealthy man. He was a legend in business circles, a billionaire who had turned his shipping company into a global empire and expanded into energy, steel, and finance. People either wanted to be him or feared him. And tonight, they filled his house. Politicians, investors, socialites, the very people whose approval determined whether you were accepted into the elite or cast aside as unworthy. Dinner was served in a grand dining room with ceilings that seemed to scrape the sky. I was seated across from Richard himself, which I thought was a good sign at first. The long table gleamed with silverware and crystal glasses, the plates carrying delicate servings of salmon with lemon butter and asparagus tips that had probably traveled farther than most of the people in the room. I barely touched mine. I was too aware of the whispers, too aware of how Richard's eyes lingered on me, cold and assessing. And then it happened. Richard lifted his glass of Bordeaux, the kind of wine that cost more for a bottle than my entire monthly rent back then, and he cleared his throat. The conversations around the table hushed instantly because when Richard Harrington spoke, people listened. His voice carried the weight of money, of influence, of authority. He looked directly at me before turning his gaze to Michael. "My son," he began, his tone smooth but dripping with condescension, "deserves better than someone from the gutter." The words sliced through the air. For a second, I thought I had misheard, that perhaps the wine or the clatter of forks had distorted his meaning. But then the silence hit me. Not the comfortable kind of silence, but the heavy, suffocating silence of dozens of people waiting for me to break. Every pair of eyes at the table turned to me. Some gleamed with pity, others with amusement. A few tried to hide their smirks behind napkins. Laughter rippled from the far end of the table, cruel and sharp like the cracking of a whip. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, my heartbeat pounding in my throat so hard I thought it might choke me. Michael froze. I glanced at him, silently begging him to say something, to defend me, to tell his father that love was stronger than arrogance. But his lips parted and no words came. He looked at me with helplessness, torn between the man who had raised him and the woman he claimed to love. And in that hesitation, I had my answer. I dug my fingernails into my palms beneath the tablecloth, leaving crescent-shaped marks in my skin just to keep myself from trembling. I could have cried. I could have stormed out in rage. I could have begged him to reconsider his words. But none of those things would have satisfied me. None of them would have preserved my dignity, so instead, I took my napkin, the pristine white fabric embroidered with the Harrington crest in gold, and folded it neatly, carefully, as though I had rehearsed this moment. I placed it beside my untouched salmon, lifted my gaze, and said in a voice so calm it surprised even me, "Thank you for dinner, Mr. Harrington." The room seemed to exhale all at once. Some gasped. Some chuckled. Richard leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smirk, convinced he had won, that he had crushed me under his heel like dirt. Michael whispered my name, but I didn't let him stop me. I rose from the table, smoothed the silk of my gown, and walked out of that room with every ounce of grace I had left. I did not cry in the hallway. I did not cry in the car that drove me home. I sat upright, my chin high, while the glittering lights of Manhattan blurred past the windows. The driver glanced at me once through the mirror, probably wondering if I was all right, but I kept my face unreadable. If there was one thing I had learned in life, it was this. Tears give them power, but silence gives you control. When I finally reached my apartment, a small 2-bedroom on the Upper West Side with peeling paint and creaky floors, I closed the door behind me and allowed myself to exhale. My gown, once so beautiful, now felt heavy on my shoulders. I slipped it off, hung it in the closet, and sat on the edge of my bed staring at the city lights. That man, Richard Harrington, had no idea who I really was. To him, I was just a girl in a borrowed world, a distraction to be discarded. But what he didn't know was that I had spent years building something of my own, something far greater than he could imagine. I had worked in silence, hiding behind names and layers of companies, quietly shaping an empire of my own. His insult hadn't broken me. It had lit a fuse. As I sat there, my phone buzzed with messages from Michael. Apologies, explanations, promises that he would talk to his father, that things would be different. I read them but did not reply. I needed no promises. I needed no explanations. I needed only one thing: time. Time to show Richard Harrington that respect is not inherited. Time to show his circle of polished elites that power can come from places they dismiss as the gutter. Time to show Michael that love without courage is no shield at all. That night, in my small apartment with its chipped window frames and the faint sound of traffic below, I made a vow to myself. The next time Richard Harrington looked at me, it would not be across a dinner table where he held the power. It would be in my world, on my terms, where his empire depended on mine. And when that day came, he would remember every word he had spoken. The morning after that humiliating dinner, Richard Harrington was supposed to sign a merger deal that would cement his dominance in the American and European markets. A $1.2 billion agreement with a company he believed was his golden ticket into European energy distribution. Horizon Dynamics. What Richard never realized, what nobody in that glittering dining room had guessed, is that Horizon Dynamics was mine. I had built it quietly, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, behind a veil of trusts and shell corporations. My name was nowhere on the official paperwork. The CEO was a man I had hired years earlier, a brilliant strategist named Anthony Cross who carried himself with quiet confidence and who never revealed his true employer. The shareholders were faceless entities scattered across Delaware, London, and Zurich. On paper, Horizon was a corporate ghost. In reality, it was my fortress. While Richard raised glasses of Bordeaux and mocked me in front of his friends, he had no idea that the very lifeline his empire needed ran through my hands. That was my secret, my weapon, and the reason his insult didn't crush me. It only fueled me. The next morning, Richard arrived at his Manhattan office on the 42nd floor of the Harrington Building, a glass tower overlooking Central Park. He came dressed in his $1,000 suit, expecting a day of victory. His board members had gathered. The documents had been prepared. His lawyers were ready to finalize the terms. And just as his pen hovered above the contract, Horizon Dynamics pulled the deal. I canceled it personally. The message was delivered through our legal team with icy precision. Horizon Dynamics no longer considered Harrington Global Enterprises a viable partner. No explanation, no negotiation, no apology, just a simple withdrawal that sent his entire board into chaos. By noon, the news had reached Wall Street. Harrington's stock plummeted by $400 million in market value. Investors panicked. Analysts speculated about fractures in his empire. Rivals whispered that the king was slipping, that the mighty Richard Harrington was not as untouchable as he had always claimed. I didn't watch the panic unfold from afar. I sat in Horizon's Manhattan headquarters on the 27th floor, my office overlooking the same skyline he believed belonged to him. I remember sipping black coffee while reading the financial updates, watching in real time as the empire of the man who had called me gutter trash began to bleed. For me, it wasn't about revenge alone. It was about balance. Richard had weaponized power as a means to humiliate others. I chose to weaponize mine in silence, with contracts, with numbers, with leverage. He had tried to strip me of dignity in front of his circle. I stripped him of security in front of the world, but my move didn't stop there. The same day I canceled his deal, I signed an agreement with his oldest rival, Charles Beaumont of Beaumont Industries in Chicago. Charles was everything Richard wasn't. While Richard carried his power like a crown, Charles wielded his like a blade, quiet, sharp, and calculated. For years, Beaumont Industries had fought to carve out a larger piece of the steel and shipping market, but Harrington's monopoly kept them pinned down. Charles had been waiting for a single crack in Harrington's armor, and I had just delivered it. We met in Chicago at the Beaumont headquarters, a building less flashy than Harrington's Manhattan Tower, but no less powerful. The walls of Charles's office were lined with maps of shipping routes and expansion plans, and his desk was piled with contracts waiting for his signature. When I walked in, he rose to greet me, a spark of curiosity in his eyes. "You're the one who pulled Horizon out from under him," he said, offering me a firm handshake. I smiled. "And I'm the one ready to give it to you." Charles laughed, a deep, satisfied sound. "Then I believe this is the beginning of a very profitable friendship." The deal was signed within hours. A partnership worth $800 million in its first phase alone, with long-term projections that would push Beaumont Industries into dominance. For every insult Richard had thrown at me, I now had the power to answer, not with words, but with contracts that shifted billions from his empire to his enemies. That evening, as my jet lifted off from O'Hare back to New York, I gazed out the window at the lights of Chicago below. I thought of Richard, probably raging in his office, his board demanding answers, his investors calling for reassurance. And I thought of Michael. He had texted me again, dozens of messages since the dinner. Apologies, pleas, promises. He said he loved me, that he didn't care what his father thought. But love without courage is fragile, and his silence at that table had already told me where his loyalty stood. I wasn't ready to decide what he meant to me yet, but I knew this. If he wanted to be part of my life, he would have to stand beside me, not behind his father's shadow. When I landed back in Manhattan, the city was alive with chatter. The financial press had already published headlines about Horizon Dynamics and Beaumont Industries. Harrington Empire stumbles. Beaumont rises with Horizon deal. The whispers that had once dismissed me as unworthy now spoke of the mysterious power player behind the scenes. They didn't know my name, but they felt my presence. Over the next few weeks, the ripple effects spread. Harrington's supply chain contracts began to weaken, as smaller firms that once depended on his dominance sought safer ground with Beaumont. European investors who had trusted Richard shifted their attention to Horizon, curious about the sudden move. Even some of Richard's allies began to hedge their bets, unwilling to tie themselves too tightly to a sinking ship. And Richard himself? He scrambled. I heard stories from mutual acquaintances about the shouting matches in his boardroom, the late-night calls to Europe, the desperate meetings with lawyers and bankers. The man who had looked down at me with smug certainty was now spending every waking hour trying to hold together the empire he thought was unshakable. But I wasn't done. Canceling a deal and signing with his rival was only the beginning. I wanted Richard to understand what true power looked like. Not inherited power, not a family name, not the weight of old money and ancestral portraits on the walls of a mansion. True power was earned, built, created by someone who had been told they weren't enough and decided to prove otherwise. So I began to plan. I called my executive team together in Horizon's boardroom, the glass walls overlooking the city. Anthony sat at my right, calm as always, while our finance director and legal counsel laid out the opportunities. We mapped every weakness in Harrington Global's empire, over-leveraged shipping routes, unsustainable energy investments, and contracts that depended too heavily on European expansion. For every stone Richard had left unturned, I had a strategy to exploit it. As we worked late into the night, I felt a fire in my chest. Not anger, not even vengeance, but purpose. Richard had given me the perfect stage to show the world who I really was. He had thought his insult would diminish me, but it had done the opposite. It had pushed me into clarity. When the meeting ended, I walked alone through the quiet office, the city glowing beyond the windows. I paused at the glass and whispered to myself, "This is only the beginning." And it was. Because the more Richard scrambled, the more I realized how much he had underestimated me. He thought I was just a woman in a silk gown, borrowing space in a world that wasn't mine. He had no idea that the world he depended on was already mine, and that I had only just begun to show him. 2 weeks after I canceled the Harrington deal and signed with Charles Beaumont, Richard came to me himself. I had expected he would send lawyers or executives first, men paid to smooth over disasters and negotiate on his behalf. But desperation has a way of stripping pride, and Richard was desperate. The meeting wasn't in his boardroom, nor in some neutral ground. It was in mine, on the 27th floor of Horizon's Manhattan headquarters. A floor designed not for intimidation, but for clarity. Glass walls overlooked the skyline, the Empire State Building standing tall in the distance. The furniture was modern, with sharp lines softened by warm oak and leather. I had chosen the space carefully when Horizon expanded into New York. I wanted it to feel like mine. Not borrowed, not inherited, but earned. When Richard arrived, he wore a $1,000 suit as expected, but the arrogance that had once gleamed in his posture was gone. He looked older than I remembered, the weight of collapsing deals and restless investors showing in the lines of his face. Still, his voice tried to carry authority as he strode into my office. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his tone low but trembling. I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing one leg over the other, and studied him. I had imagined this moment more times than I could count, imagined how I would feel when the man who humiliated me had to face me on equal terms. Yet when it finally came, I didn't feel glee or vengeance. I felt control, and that was better. "I understand perfectly," I replied. My voice was steady, every word deliberate. "You thought respect was inherited. You thought wealth made you untouchable. But every empire has cracks. You just forgot to check where yours began." He bristled, his jaw tightening. "You think you've won because of a few contracts? Because of some alliance with Beaumont? I built my company from the ground up, while you—" He stopped himself, catching the insult before it left his lips. For once he remembered that his words had consequences. I smiled faintly, though not kindly. "You built it, yes. But you also assumed it would never fall. That arrogance is why you're sitting here now, in my office, asking me for mercy." Behind me, the city glittered, indifferent to his downfall. Behind him, standing by the glass wall, was Michael. He had insisted on being present, and I allowed it. Michael had made his choice. In the days following the dinner, he had broken from his father publicly. It had cost him everything. The heir's seat at the Harrington board, the penthouse apartment paid for by family trust funds, the network of allies who had always smiled because of his last name. But he hadn't flinched. He had told his father plainly, "If you cannot respect her, you cannot respect me." That cost him, and it bound him to me in a way no promise ring ever could. Now he stood with me, silent but steady, his eyes on his father. It was a strange symmetry. Richard facing the woman he had called unworthy, and his son standing beside her. Richard shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "You don't know the enemies you're making," he warned. "You think Beaumont is your ally? He'll turn on you the moment it suits him. That's how this world works. I've spent 40 years navigating it." I rose from my chair slowly, not out of anger, but to meet him at eye level. "You're right about one thing," I said. "This world is ruthless. But unlike you, I don't underestimate people. I don't dismiss them because of where they came from or what they look like. And that, Richard, is why Horizon is stronger than your empire. Because people trust me, they choose me. And you—" I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. "You're running out of people to stand with you." I walked to my desk and placed a document on the polished surface. A supply agreement worth $200 million with European investors who had once been his closest allies. I signed it in front of him, the sound of my pen scratching across the paper louder than his shallow breathing. When I slid the document toward Anthony, my CEO, Richard's face paled. He knew what it meant. He watched as his world shifted again, knowing the woman he had dismissed as nothing now held the strings to his survival. "This isn't about revenge," I told him. "It's about respect. You stood in your home, in front of your friends, and you called me unworthy. You thought humiliation was power? But here's the truth. The only humiliation that lasts is the kind you bring upon yourself. You've done that. Not me." Richard tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, the man who had towered over boardrooms and governments alike seemed small. His empire was crumbling, his allies deserting him, his son standing at my side instead of his. Michael finally stepped forward. His voice was calm, but his eyes carried years of suppressed pain. "Father, you taught me numbers, contracts, strategies. But you never taught me respect. She did, that's why I'm here. And if you want to save what's left of your company, you'll start by learning what you failed to teach me. The silence in the room was absolute. Richard swallowed hard, his pride battling with the reality pressing down on him. He straightened, though the effort looked painful. So this is what it comes to, he muttered. My son is against me. My company is in the hands of a stranger. I met his eyes. Not a stranger. The very woman you called unworthy. And that is the lesson you'll never forget. He left without shaking hands, without another word. The door closed behind him, the echo reverberating through the glass walls. I stood still, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of my desk, breathing in the silence he left behind. Michael turned to me then, searching my face. Are you all right? He asked softly. I nodded, though the truth was more complex. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't triumphant either. What I felt was deeper than that. I felt vindicated. Richard had thought respect was his birthright. I had shown him it wasn't. Respect had to be earned, and he had failed to earn mine. That night, as the city lights glowed beyond the glass, I thought about the path that had brought me here. From my small apartment on the Upper West Side to this office that overlooked Manhattan, from humiliation in a gilded dining room to power at the head of my own table. Every step had been fought for, every word earned. The confrontation with Richard wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the next phase. His empire was still standing, though barely. He would fight to salvage what was left, and I would be ready. But for the first time, he knew the truth. He knew that the woman he had dismissed, the woman he tried to humiliate, the woman he called nothing, was the one who held his empire in her hands. And that was more powerful than any revenge I could have imagined. Months slipped by after that confrontation, but the echoes of it rippled far beyond the walls of my office. The Harrington name, once spoken with fear and reverence in American business circles, no longer carried the weight it once did. It was still known, of course, it would take years for Richard's empire to crumble completely, but the aura of invincibility had vanished. And in the world of money and power, perception was everything. His stock prices continued to falter. Old allies withdrew their capital, some quietly, others publicly, distancing themselves from the man whose arrogance had blinded him. European partners who once celebrated his dominance now chose horizon. And every time a new headline appeared, Harrington Global misses quarterly targets or Harrington forced into asset sales, I thought of that dinner, of that single sentence that was meant to break me. But it wasn't just numbers and contracts that revealed his decline. It was the whispers, the subtle changes in tone when people spoke of him. I would overhear his name at charity galas, at private dinners in Manhattan, at investment meetings in Boston. He overplayed his hand. He underestimated the wrong woman. The crown slipped. They no longer looked at him as a king. They looked at him as a cautionary tale. And then came the estate. The Newport mansion, where the chandeliers glittered above me as he humiliated me, where I folded my napkin and walked away, was put up for sale. The Harringtons had owned that property for 3 generations, using it as their summer retreat, hosting lavish galas that cemented their place among America's elite. For Richard to sell it was not just a financial necessity, it was an admission of defeat. When the listing appeared, I didn't hesitate. I didn't buy it out of spite, though I would be lying if I said the thought didn't cross my mind. I bought it because I could. Because I wanted to stand in the very place where I had been dismissed and claim it as mine. The papers were signed within a week. The keys were handed to me in a velvet box, and for the first time in my life, I walked into that house not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as its owner. Michael was by my side when we crossed the threshold. He looked around the grand foyer, at the sweeping staircase, at the gold-framed portraits that still lined the walls, and he let out a slow breath. It feels different already, he said softly, and he was right. The air no longer carried the sharp edge of judgment. The house no longer felt like a stage for humiliation. It was mine now, and I intended to fill it with something Richard never could: warmth. We began renovations immediately. Not to erase the past, but to transform it. The ballroom where Richard once raised his glass and called me unworthy became a library, lined with shelves of books and sunlight pouring through tall windows. The dining hall, where I had left my salmon untouched, was opened up into a space for laughter, not cruelty. Long tables where friends could gather without fear of scorn. Every chandelier, Every polished marble floor became a reminder of how far I had come. Not as a trophy of vengeance, but as a symbol of reclamation. Michael and I would walk through the halls at night, planning the future. We spoke of children, of filling those rooms with footsteps and voices instead of cold silences. We spoke of business too, of course. He was no longer the heir to Harrington Global, but he had found his place in Horizon. Not because I handed it to him, but because he chose to earn it, working alongside my team, proving himself not as a son of Richard Harrington, but as Michael, his own man. Richard never apologized. I didn't expect him to. Men like him rarely do. Pride was his armor, and even when it cracked, he clung to it. But in the silence that followed his fall, I knew he had learned something, even if he never spoke it aloud, because he stopped challenging me. He no longer sent lawyers to block my contracts. He no longer tried to poach my investors. He no longer raised his glass in rooms full of allies and mocked anyone he considered beneath him. He retreated slowly into the shadows of the empire he had once dominated, while I stepped forward into the light. That was an apology enough, and the truth? The lesson was clear. Respect cannot be bought. It cannot be demanded. It cannot be inherited through names carved into estate gates or portraits hung in gilded frames. It must be earned every day through the way you treat others, through the choices you make when the world is watching, and especially when it isn't. I had earned mine by standing tall when he tried to break me. I proved it to his circle, to his son, and most importantly, to myself. I had walked into that house once as an outsider, and I walked back in as its owner. I had sat in his boardroom once as a woman underestimated, and I stood in mine as the one signing contracts worth hundreds of millions. I had been dismissed as gutter trash, and now I held the crown he dropped when his arrogance toppled him. The irony was almost poetic. Years later, when people spoke of Richard Harrington, they didn't remember him as the man who owned Newport, or as the billionaire who built an empire of steel and ships. They remembered him as the man who underestimated the wrong woman. And when they spoke of me, they didn't call me his daughter-in-law, or his rival, or his replacement. They called me what I had always been, a force of my own making. One evening, long after the renovations were finished, I stood in the library where the ballroom once glittered with chandeliers. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Michael sat in an armchair with a book, the soft lamplight casting a golden glow across his face. I watched him for a while, my heart swelling with something deeper than triumph. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about building something real. About choosing love over pride, respect over arrogance, dignity over humiliation. And as I looked around at the home I had remade, I understood something I hadn't before. Richard Harrington thought he had destroyed me that night in Newport. But all he had done was hand me the fire I needed to rise. In the end, I didn't just walk away with dignity. I walked away with his crown.